أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Wassalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a weekend night. I know there are a lot of other things you could be doing. I want to first thank by thanking the organizers for putting this important event on. I think it's really important, not just as Americans living in a highly racialized society, and for Muslims, but also even for us spiritually and religiously, to understand the history of Islam and the black history of within Islam, and to also understand race and racism. And we got a great primer from Ustada Aisha Prime. Those of you who were here for that first part, really her words were gold. And maybe you know this, maybe you don't. It's not easy to find this information. It has been actually, in some ways intentionally, in other ways unintentionally suppressed and overlooked. So what you heard from her, I don't know if it was recorded, but please make sure you think about it and read your notes, go over it again, and do even further research onto this. It's very, very important history and knowledge for all of you to have. So I'm going to cover some of the same ground, inshallah, from a slightly different lecture. So I was asked a different perspective. I was asked to speak about race, racism, the prison industrial complex, and Islam. So we'll start out, I study philosophy, so we always like to have a clear definition of what we're talking about. So what is race? Okay, social construct. Race, the particular idea that we have of race, it's not a universal thing. Race isn't the same everywhere, and race hasn't always been the same throughout time. So for example, the Irish at one point were not considered white, and then they became white. When I lived in Nigeria, when I was young, I was considered yellow. Then when I came to the States, all of a sudden I became black. So one of the important things to understand about race is that it's not something that's universal, and that the history of this term, this idea, this social construct, this way of thinking about and categorizing people has not always been the same. It's changed over time, and it's not universal, and it's not an Islamic concept. Nowhere in the Islamic tradition, until you see the influence of Europe within the Islamic tradition, text in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, any of the many Islamic languages of West Africa, Wolof, Hausa, Fulfulde, Yoruba, there's no equivalent category of race. That's not how Islamically people were divided up. In the Quran, you have languages, colors, but you don't have something that puts together physical features, biology, and then these other things about cultural aspects in this term in race. And so to understand race, to understand racism, we have to understand race, and to understand race, we have to understand where it came from. So where did this idea come from? That there's a box you check, you're black, you're Asian, you're this, you're that. Where did that come from? So that very idea of race also implies a certain philosophy, a certain conception of what a human being is and what the value of a human being is. So it's not a neutral term, race. It's not something like hair color, eye color, you're Maghribi, I'm Nigeri, something like that. It's not like race is not a neutral concept. So if we look at the history of race, W. Du Bois, I think, has one of the most profound statements on this. He said, the medieval world, the medieval Christian world, knew the African as a heathen, but still as a fellow human being. After the so-called Renaissance and so-called Enlightenment, the African had become a subhuman. The African was now seen as part of the black race, and that black race was seen as being subhuman, not being a full human being. How did this happen? This happened through the process of the various names for it, for the secularization. One Jamaican philosopher, Sylvia Wynter, calls it the de-godding, the desacralization of the Western European worldview, even inside the church, even inside the Roman Catholic Church, even amongst individual Christians. Now what happens is this, in medieval, even before medieval Christianity, going back to the ancient Greeks, they have a concept called the Great Chain of Being, in which everything in the cosmos was organized in a hierarchy. So you have similar things within the Islamic tradition. Everything has a maqam ma'lum. Everything has a known station, a hierarchy, its place with God. At the top of the hierarchy in medieval Christianity is God. Right below God, you have the angels. Underneath the angels, you have the saints. Underneath the saints, you have the ordinary people. And then you have, depending on who's writing about it, then you have the sinners, then you have animals, then you have plants, and at the bottom you have rocks. Sometimes they put the sinners and the demons below, even below the rocks. But that's basically it. And your rank on the chain of being is how much you're like the thing which is at the top of the chain of being, the thing which is the measure of all things, which is God. Right? The more God-like you are, that's why saints are above sinners. They're more like God. And that's why men, human beings, are above plants, because human beings are created in the image of God. Now, what marks for the medieval Christians, what marks you as being made in the image of God is this faculty they call the intellectus, the aql in Arabic, basically. But it doesn't mean just like 1 + 1 is 2. It's your ability to directly know and understand God in Scripture. In Christian terms, it's often likened to the Holy Spirit, and somewhat equivalent to the ruh in Arabic. So the degree to which you submit to the ruh, the degree to which you submit to God, the degree to which you're saintly, that determines your rank on this chain of being. What happens as God gets cut out of the picture, for all intents and purposes, even though people are still Christian and still going to church and so on and so forth, for the way in which you view the world, once God is no longer part of that picture, who's on the top? You don't have any more saints. You don't have any, if God's not the measure of all things, what else is there? Human beings. And it's just human beings. It is not just human beings as such, because it becomes now a particular type of human being. It becomes Western, white, rational European man. That becomes the measure of all things. So instead, in medieval times, when you had this great chain of being, you'd have these hierarchies of angels. You have this cherubim up here, and then the seraphim, and this and that. Instead, what you get is you get a great chain of being in texts of biology, in texts of what they call natural philosophy, in which you have rational man, who's now white and European, on top of the great chain of being, and you have these racial hierarchies. Now, because the degree to which your level on the chain of being is based on your similarity to that thing which is on the top. So the thing that's on the top is Western, white, rational European man. The closer you are to that, the higher you are. So they say Persians are better than Arabs. Japanese are better than Chinese. And then at the bottom of the rung of humanity, you have Africans or Native Americans, depending on the thinker. Now, before, what marked you as being made in the image of God, that made you dignified in this model, was your intellect, intellectus in Latin. What the intellectus now in this thing, it's no longer spiritual, it's purely rational. It's just logic. 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 2 is 4, A then B, B then C, therefore A then C. That's it. And so the degree to which you can be rational is the degree to which you are on the chain of being. So you get this is where the science of racism and race comes from. You take God out of the picture, you elevate man, man basically takes the place of God. You judge everything not by man, not by humanity as such, but by a particular kind of humanity, which they then think only Western white European people have this rationality, and everybody else is judged in accordance to them. People aren't judged according to some transcendent ideal of sanctity, sainthood, how God-like you are, but you're judged according to the degree to which you are like rational Western white European men. And then a bunch of other things happen, but kind of cut a long story short. So you get philosophers in the so-called Enlightenment period, like Kant, who say that just as plants exist for the sake of animals, and animals exist for the sake of human beings at a lower level of rationality, lower races of human beings exist for the sake of human beings at a higher level of rationality. Right? So black and brown people are to the Europeans of the Enlightenment the same thing that animals are to people. Right? And so, of course, this is the period when you get the beginnings of the slave trade and of imperialism. Why? Because these people, and the slave trade, I should mention here, there are different kinds of slavery. There's modern slavery, modern chattel slavery, in which the slaves are not human beings. They're chattel, they're property. Then there's ancient slavery, which you have in the Muslim world, ancient Greek world, all this, in which the slaves are still human beings and still have legal rights. Right? There's slavery in the Islamic world. There's trans-Saharan slave trade across the Mediterranean, these kinds of things. But the difference is the slavery is not racialized, and the people who are enslaved are not dehumanized in the way in which they are in modern slavery that you get in this de-godded secular system. So of course, this is the justification, or one of the justifications, for the imperial project. You go conquer the world, you exploit the people, you exploit their resources. Why? And you're perfectly justified in doing it, according to them. In fact, they should even be grateful because you're bringing them civilization and rationality and all of these things. Why? Because they're not full human beings. They're not full human beings like you are. You're, in fact, by conquering them, brutalizing them, stealing all of their stuff, by taking them to school and teaching them your way of doing things, you're raising their level of humanity. Right? It's horrible, but this is the logic. This is how things happen historically. And it still goes on today. You talk about development agencies. It's the same logic animating this. Another deformation happened with this chain of being, in which they temporalized it. So the person at the top of the great chain of being, it used to be static. What happens with some philosophers like Kant and Hegel is the chain of being becomes temporalized so that the top of the chain becomes actually in the future. Right? So through rationality, Western white European man is bringing all of humanity towards this glorious future and progress. So this is where our idea of progress comes from. And it's so seeped into our everyday culture and our language, we say, I can't believe this is happening, it's 2019. When traditionally, if you think of an Islamic point of view, who's the best of generations? What's the best of generations? For the prophets. And the one after that? And the one after that? You have the exact opposite view of progress. You have periods of tajdeed and renewal, and it's not just Islam. You find this in every single religious tradition. The best time is the time of the founder of the tradition, the time of the ancestors, and over time things get worse and worse. And if God is merciful, he'll send you someone to help you renew things. But you renew things, you don't progress. You renew, it's a tajdeed, it's a renewal, it's not a progression. Now this view of progress, it's so seeped into everybody's mind. We need to progress, it's 2019, how could this be happening? But that's completely counter to the view of time, of progress, of worth and value within the Islamic tradition. And with really any serious religious tradition at all. And it comes from this deformation of the great chain of being that you get with secularization. And it gives rise to racism, it gives justification to imperialism. People wanted to exploit people anyway, they wanted to. But you had the church and you had all these other things that made it difficult to justify doing that. Once God is out of the picture, you can start doing all kinds of things to people. So this is the origin, this is the intellectual context in which the category of race emerges. And it evolves and changes throughout time a little bit. Who's white, who counts as white, who doesn't count as white changes. The Irish can become white, the Jews can become white. Even who counts as black changes. You know, in Virginia, they passed the one-drop rule. And so who counts as black changes. And it works differently in different situations. As Ustada Aisha Prime pointed out to us, the different countries, Catholic countries had a different racial hierarchy than Protestant countries. Protestant countries were a bit more, quote-unquote, advanced with this secularization than the Catholic countries. Right? So for Catholic countries, they still had this idea that these people who are non-white are still inferior, but they can still become part of the church, and we still have this idea that all of us Christians are the same, and so we can marry each other. So that's why any place that was colonized by Catholics, you have a large mixed population. Any place that was colonized by Protestants, they wipe everybody out. Right? Think about it. The US, how many Native Americans do we have running around here? Yeah. Versus you go to Mexico. You go to Brazil. The French areas. The French in Haiti, there was a whole class of people, what they called colored, gens de couleur, who intermarried. So the Catholic view was different. The Germans were the worst. Anywhere the Germans went, they just tried to wipe everybody out. And then finally in World War II, they turned it against the quote-unquote white people. But they had been doing that to other people for a long time. So this is just to give you a bit of a background of the theological and philosophical origins of the category of race. It's not a neutral term. It's not something that's a universal. It's not something that you're not born with a race. Race is something that comes from this kind of philosophy of what a human being is, what value is, what progress is. And it's very antithetical to the Islamic tradition. Now you have something like racism. You have prejudice based on origins and based on appearance within Muslim history. Right? So because you could only enslave non-Muslims and trade them as slaves, So especially in the Maghreb, a number of slaves were captured. People were enslaved, non-Muslims from West Africa were captured and enslaved and sent to Morocco. And so in Morocco and some other lands, you have this association of blackness, black skin, African origins with servitude, lowliness, these kinds of things. So you have these things, even in the pre-modern era, you have something that's kind of like racism, but it's not the same because the whole structure, the idea of what a human being is completely different. And you also, again, because it's different, everybody's mixed. Right? The Moroccan king, the current Moroccan king, he's an eighth, his great-grandmother is from Timbuktu. Right? And also, as I mentioned before, the slavery in the Islamic lands and Islamic law is very different from the chattel slavery that you get with the Europeans in the New World. Almost a different institution. Now so when we get to the US then, so you get this idea of race. It provides a theoretical and then in some cases theological justification for the mass enslavement and brutalization of Africans. And as Ustada Aisha Prime told us, the brutality of not only the transatlantic, the Middle Passage, but the brutality of the plantations where people were working is almost impossible for us to imagine. The life expectancy for enslaved people in Jamaica was 7 years or 11 years. They would literally work people to death because it was cheaper to just bring more people in and work them to death. If you revolted, Ustada Aisha Prime told us about some of the horrible things they would do. They would even put gunpowder in people's orifices and blow them up. The level of dehumanization, you can't even imagine it. This is only made possible through this construct of race. That these people are not human, we are human, and we can treat them any way we like. We can treat them even worse than animals. So this notion of race was also essential economically. So as the European powers are competing with each other and they're trying to grow their different empires, the most efficient way for them to do this is to just capture resources from other people. You invest some money in some guns and some things like that, and instead of trading with people. Trading's more expensive. It's easy to just take over something, enslave people, and then get the resources out. And make the people work for you. It's free labor. During the time before the Haitian Revolution, Haiti was responsible for 70% of France's economy. Most of the world's sugar and coffee, and sugar was back then was like oil today. It's an incredibly profitable commodity. The French economy depended on Haiti, which is why they hated losing it so much, why they actually fought quite hard to keep it. So these economies, the economy of Belgium was built on what they did with rubber in the Congo. The British economy was built to a large part on, thank you, not only the slave plantations they had in Jamaica and other places, but then later on the colonial methods of extraction that they had. So you have this particular way of getting profit from people. And to this it was new for them. They didn't do this before. This new way, the way in which you maintain the structure, this kind of structure, the way in which you prevent alliances between poor white people and enslaved people is through doubling down on this racial difference. So it's a great quote. I want to read it so I make sure I don't get it right. From LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, the former president of the US. He said, "If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Give him someone to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you." Right? So this system of race and racism, of creating a racial hierarchy of humanity, was essential for allowing what was kind of early stage capitalist expansion, in which all European economies are built on. If you go to Europe and like, wow, things are so nice here. Why are they so nice and why are they so bad where I'm from? This is exactly why. It's bad where you're from because they took all the good stuff. Because they exploited things and they built their empires, they built their palaces, they took their jewels. The crown jewel of Queen Victoria is from India, the Kohinoor diamond. One of them's from India, one of them's from South Africa. So This was how they built this. And the system of racism was essential for creating these class divisions, not only to justify the exploitation of people, but also to prevent the lower classes from uniting and rising up together. Now, then there are some different economic and other changes, and it becomes the most profitable thing to do isn't necessarily just to enslave people. It's to, in a certain sense, colonize them and to co-opt them into your economy. Right? So you can make money on people coming and going. So you can profit from their labor, you give them a little bit of a wage, and then you can get that wage back by selling them the goods that you make from their labor. Right? So still today, in a lot of quote-unquote third world countries, the resources come from there, they're processed, they go somewhere else, they're made, and then they're shipped back to those countries who then buy them. Right? So you make money coming and going. And so it becomes, in a certain sense, a more efficient, a different way of making money. And so this is when you switch to, you get these anti-slavery efforts, some of which are sincerely motivated, some of which are cynically motivated just by profit. So in the US example, you move from slavery to sharecropping. So you have people picking cotton under these brutal conditions of slavery. It's not to say that conditions of slavery weren't brutal and that emancipation didn't do anything. But in some ways, in some areas, not all areas, but in some areas, sharecropping was actually more economically efficient. Right? Because if you're enslaving someone, you have to pay for their upkeep, give them some kind of clothes, a little bit of food, exactly. Under sharecropping, you can pay them a pittance, a little bit of a wage, for basically the same work. And then you can have them give that wage back to you for you to provide them with food, clothes, etc. So in the US, it becomes sharecropping. You get colonial economies all over the rest of the world. And then things kind of shift again. In the US, you start getting industrialization. And free black people start moving to the north and to these cities, these city centers. And you need, especially with World War II, you need there's all of this factories and industry, and you just need people. At this time, you don't have enough people to produce all the planes, all the bombs, all the machines, the roads, everything that you need. So you need black people to do this work for you, especially in these northern cities and in the colonies as well too. It's important to remember that these things aren't developing in isolation, right? It's not just the U.S. and Africa over here and Asia over there. These systems are connected. It's one of the great things that, especially after his Hajj, what Hajj Malik Shabazz pointed out. The struggles, yes, it's different in different places, it's local conditions different, but the overall system is very similar, if not the same. So the struggle is very similar, if not the same. So in the US, for example, you get Jim Crow. So you get segregation in these northern cities. So you're put in a separate place, you're allowed to go to work, you're allowed to do this, but you're restricted in terms of where you can live, what you can buy, even the water fountain and the toilets that you can use. Right? And then South Africa perfects this system with apartheid. You have almost identical things going on in colonial Algeria as well too. People live in a separate city, they're only allowed to go certain places, use certain things, and they're exploited, quite often quite brutally. Now in the South, you have something different. The South doesn't industrialize for a bunch of other reasons. The South of the US doesn't industrialize for several reasons. But in the South, what you get is you still want to take advantage of black labor. And so what you get is a criminalization of black life. I don't know how many of you guys have seen the documentary 13th on Netflix. It's great. If you haven't, you should really see it. It's very worthwhile. So in the South, they developed this system of, okay, how can we capture black labor? And there's this exception in the 13th Amendment. You can't force people to work for free unless they've committed a crime. So what do? You criminalize black life. If you're walking on the wrong side of the road, you go to jail. If you spit in the wrong place, you go to jail. If you do anything, it's basically criminal. Walking while black can be a crime. I mean, it still is. In Ferguson, after the riots in Ferguson, when they went through and they looked at the code in Ferguson, the number of black people who were arrested for jaywalking, for loitering, for all of these things, it's just code for walking while black, for walking in a suspicious manner. That gets you into the criminal justice system, and then they can use your labor. So you see all these chain gangs and things like that. The roads in the South, the new infrastructure in the South was built by virtually enslaved African Americans through this process of the criminalization of black lives so they can exploit black labor. Now, there were two models in the late 19th century of incarceration. You had a northern model, which was based on kind of rehabilitation, in which they viewed criminality as a psychological disorder, not as like due to poverty or something, but criminality is due to something's wrong with your brain or with your psyche. And so they tried to play people music and put them in fancy-ish kind of psychiatric hospital type places. And they think like, oh, if we give you enough light and lock you up and give you books to read or something like that, maybe you'll come back and be better, not addressing the actual poverty. But that was the idea. The southern model was punishment and exploitation. You did something wrong, we're going to make life hard for you. And that's the point of imprisonment is incarceration. Southern model is way more profitable and it wins out. So the southern model gets adopted US-wide as kind of the model for incarceration. What you get then after the industrial boom in the US is kind of over, the big manufacturing moves elsewhere. Everything's made in China, Indonesia, Bangladesh, something like that. What do you do then with all these black people? Right? They're surplus to the economy, and poor people. They're surplus to the economy. You don't really need their labor. You need some people in service jobs. You need some people to work in McDonald's. Right? But you don't need all of these people as labor. So how are we going to make money off of them? The spreading of the southern model of punitive, exploitative imprisonment. So you get what some sociologists have called the ghetto prison industrial complex, in which people are still segregated residentially. In fact, now the US is more residentially segregated than it was in the 60s. You can look it up. It's bizarre. I didn't believe it when I first heard it on NPR. So you still have residential segregation enforced through things like redlining, not through official practice, like Jim Crow is official law, not through official laws, but through these unofficial practices, which banks won't give you loans in certain areas. So there's certain areas of New York City, Chicago, for example, are marked, these are where black people live. And you create these ghettos, and the people move from the ghettos to schools, which are underfunded because the finances for schools come from property taxes. If the property there has no value, the schools have no money, and people move from the hood to the schools to prison. And in prison, the labor, you can work, they pay people 15 cents an hour, 10 cents an hour, making license plates, making chairs, doing call center things for Starbucks, Victoria's Secret, all of this stuff. So the exploitation on a racial basis, it's not explicitly racial anymore. It's not explicitly racial, but it's implicitly racial. The structures are still there. So there's a continuous line you can draw from enslavement of people to the kind of sharecropping exploitation system that you have, to the prison system, to now we have this prison industrial complex. So currently today, I think it's 1.7, 1.8 million African-American men incarcerated in the US. In 1850, there weren't even 1 million slaves, 1 million black male slaves in the US. So the level of this, it's a good book Michelle Alexander calls, she calls it the new Jim Crow, which these prisons have taken over as a new way of controlling black people, of controlling black labor. And now the new thing that's happening, if you watch 13th, at the end of 13th, you see in the documentary, the new thing is immigration prisons. Because right? there's a bit of political support on both sides of the aisle. We'll see if anything comes of it for prison reform. To relook at sentencing laws and this problem of mass incarceration in this country. So like, okay, so now where are we going to get because a lot of our industries rely on prison labor, whether it's for the call centers, whether it's for cheap production. If you don't want to send your stuff to Bangladesh or Indonesia or to China, you do it at prisons here in the States. So how are we going to keep this going if there's actually some kind of prison reform? Immigration prisons. So we have these massive immigration prisons set up, with unfortunately not a lot written about them in Texas and other places where they house immigration cases. And again, there's not as much outrage about it because the people who are being basically imprisoned there, exploited there, are perceived as being not white, and implicitly then perceived as being not fully human. So even though explicitly everybody's abandoned this, if you say, no, of course a black person is just as human, of course a black American citizen is every bit an American citizen as anybody else. But there are loads of psychological studies, even studies on news reports. If a little white girl goes missing versus a little black girl goes missing, what happens, right? Those poor people in prisons at the border right now, the ICE prison, who would keep the kids in cages. Imagine if they were Swedish. Well, like run the counterfactual. If we had a bunch of Swedish people in cages, what do you think would happen? No one would stand for it. No, but because they're brown, they're perceived as cruelty and punishment to them is perceived as not being as much of a crime, not being as horrible of a thing. So even though explicitly people have gotten rid of this or they denounce, and not even everybody's denounced it, this idea of race and racism, it still structures to a large degree, this great chain of being, this racial hierarchy, still structures to a large degree the way in which people are treated, not only in this country, but around the world. So it's really important for us to understand what race is, what racism is, where it comes from, and how it operates in our society. It's important for us personally, spiritually, so that we don't fall into this. It's a poison. It's a poison. To regard a fellow human being as not being a fellow human being is a great sin. It's a great spiritual sin and poison. And unfortunately, if you grow up in the US, you're trained unconsciously, automatically to do this. Wherever you come from, white, black, anything, it's part of, unless you've had people or an alternative perspective or someone come and help you, it's in the air, you pick it up. So it's important for us, first and foremost, spiritually for ourselves, to recognize and respect all of God's creation, especially those whom He's honored. لَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. To respect those to whom God has commanded us to show respect. It's important for us personally and spiritually. Then it's also very important for us socially. We shouldn't forget those of us who are comfortable. We shouldn't forget where our comfort comes from. The current economic system is by no means halal in any way. Even if you're using Islamic banking or anything, the fruits of our labor, most of our labor, are tied into these economic systems which are at their root deeply unjust and founded on the dehumanization and exploitation of people, either people here in the United States or people around the world. Force people to work in sweatshops in Bangladesh, where they die if there's a fire. You pay them wages that are unfair. So it's important for us to recognize personally, but also socially as well too. And to understand the deep injustices that not only our societies were founded upon. Yes, there was slavery, yes, there's Jim Crow. It's not all fixed now. The deep injustices that continue to animate and actually produce the wealth of our societies. And it's also important socially and then even broader politically. So Ustadha Aisha Prime gave us many examples, many great examples of African Muslims throughout history who were in situations which they looked around and they saw this society is unjust. Going all the way back to even well before Uthman Dan Fodio. So take, for example, Almami Abu Bakr Khan led one of the first African abolitionist movements in what's today Fouta Toro, what's today northern Senegal. He led a jihad. He got together his students, his scholars. They armed themselves, and they took over this region where people were selling Muslims as slaves. So these kings who were nominally Muslim, but they would sell other Muslims as slaves to the French. So he came, and the story goes that he and his students, I mean, he was a teacher of Quran, fiqh, hadith, tasawwuf, you name it, he studied it and taught it. He and his students came with knives to this king, to the court of the king. And they said, either we shave your head and you take shahada again and become a real Muslim and stop this, or we put the knives in your chest. And so they led a rebellion. They established the imamate of Fouta Toro. And anyone who entered there, if they said the shahada, they were Muslim and they couldn't be enslaved. He said, it doesn't matter, even if they can't pronounce Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Even if they stutter and say, Asadu ala, if you say the Shahada, you're a Muslim and you cannot be enslaved, and we'll protect you. Now, of course, this was bad business for the French, so what do the French do? The French go and find all the kings who he dethroned. They give them lots of guns, and they help them to reconquer Futa Toro and reinstitute the slave trade. But he outlawed the slave trade completely in Futa Toro. And this was even noticed by the British abolitionists. William Wilberforce and the British Abolitionist Society, they actually quoted, they said we should take notice of even the African Muslim, the Moorish leader, Abdul Qadir, has outlawed the slave trade, seeing the evils it's done amongst his people. So he did this in 1776. He looked around at his society and he said, this is unjust. This is not right. This is not Islamic in any way at all. And he took action. Usman Dan Fodio looked around and again also saw Muslims being sold into slavery, Muslims being exploited, women not being allowed to be educated. There's a whole list of things that he writes up when he gives his explanation for launching his jihad. He launches a jihad, conquers the Hausa kingdoms there, and establishes the Sokoto Caliphate, which was one of the last places in which kind of the totality of Islamic law and scholarship and everything was practiced. It fell to the British in 1803. Oh, 1903, not 1803, 1903. Fell to the British in 1903. He established it about 100 years earlier, 1803, 1809. He looked around at his society and he saw problems. But he didn't start by just picking up a sword. He started by educating people. He and his family started by educating people, wrote these incredible texts in which he compresses generations and generations of Maliki fiqh into very, very condensed, understandable texts in all of the Islamic sciences. You have Sheikh Amadou Bamba in Senegal. Maybe some of you have heard him. Incredible scholar. He goes around and again notices these unjust practices, and he creates his own teaching villages. Come, you can learn the Quran, we'll teach you Arabic, we'll teach you fiqh, we'll teach you tasawwuf, all of these different things. And someone once came to him and tried to offer him a slave as a gift. And Sheikh Amadou Bamba said, do you own this person? And he said, yes, I own this person. He said, well, if you own this person, then you must own me too, because the same person who owns this person owns me. Meaning God. Only God is we're all, all of us are ibadullah. So Amadou Bamba, through his examples, setting these teaching schools and teaching schools throughout the Senegambia region, created places, and was able to, he was exiled by the French. They tried to kill him numerous times, but it didn't work, alhamdulillah. And he was able to negotiate a kind of autonomy from the French government in which he said, look, if you leave us alone, don't force us to send our kids to your schools. Let us govern our lives according to Sharia. Here, let me teach our students the way we want to teach them the Quran and these things. We will give you the peanut crops. They needed peanut crops. So he was able to negotiate a kind of autonomy for himself and his community. So he created these communities of justice and peace. And you see this example all throughout West Africa and even other places in the Muslim world as well too. When people see that there's a society that's unjust, that things around them are unjust, they first establish justice within themselves. As Hajj Malik Shabazz said, we got to get on God's side so that God is on our side. They first establish justice and righteousness within themselves, then they teach a small community, then that community grows, and they try to maintain and establish justice within that society that way. And sometimes that leads to a revolution that overthrows things, and sometimes it doesn't. But today you can go to West Africa, and these teaching villages that were founded by these different shuyukh are still there. Touba was founded by Sheikh Amadou Bamba. It's still a semi-autonomous region of Senegal. It's run by his descendants, and certain things that are legal in Senegal are not legal there. There's no alcohol allowed in Touba. There's no tobacco allowed in Touba. It's run really as it's almost as a state within a state because of the mission of Amadou Bamba. He saw the evils going on around him, slavery in addition to other things, and he was able to first establish himself in the model of the Sunnah, then to help others through education to establish that, then to establish a whole community that persists to this day. In Senegal, every year they have a pilgrimage called the Magal that celebrates Amadou Bamba's, actually his being sent into exile. It's an interesting story about that. But every year it attracts almost as many pilgrims as the Hajj. 3 million people a year go to the Magal. in celebration of Ahmadou Bamba and his legacy. So these, it can feel hopeless when we look at everything. When we look at the scale. Look at China, look what China is doing to the Uyghurs. Look at sweatshops all over the world. Look at what's happening even in our own communities, with prisons, with drugs, with all of these different things that afflict us. It seems hopeless. But you have to remember our ancestors, sometimes our literal ancestors, but also our ancestors in the deen, in the religion. Think about what they were going through in the conditions of slavery, in the conditions of colonialism. In some ways, far more difficult in some ways than what we're facing now. They didn't lose hope. They didn't quit. They didn't just go along with the flow. They were able to, again, first establish justice and righteousness with Adlon and Qist within themselves, then teach others around them, and from there to grow communities of this, where you can have these kind of oases of truth and justice and peace in a world filled with oppression. And that's the lesson I think we have to take from this history of race and racism and Islamic forms of resistance to it. And there's so many more. I wish more of you were here for Sada Aisha Prime's talk. She gave us many, many great examples of even enslaved people in Brazil. She mentioned these Malay revolts. The enslaved Muslims in Brazil had a higher literacy rate than their Portuguese slavers. They set up Quran schools. People were studying Maliki fiqh there. They would actually pool their money together, as the system in slavery in Brazil worked a little bit differently. So once you finished your stuff working for your master, you could go subcontract out, do some of your own work. You'd still have to give your master a cut, but you could keep some money. They would pool their money together and find someone or some ship going to West Africa so they could buy Qur'ans. They could buy texts of fiqh. They could buy texts of tasawwuf. And they would teach them there. And eventually this led to the Malay revolts, in which they declared jihad against their oppressors. They almost took over the capital of Salvador in the northeastern part of Brazil, which is where most of them were. So they actually sent the leaders back to Nigeria because they were afraid of making them martyrs. But this established this tradition of Islamic education and resistance in Brazil, in which, I mean, can you imagine the conditions in which most of us feel like we have no time now? But they really had no time. They were enslaved. And even in those conditions, they found time to teach Quran, to model the Sunnah, to teach Hadith, to teach all of these things to the people around them, and establish communities that stood for justice and truth. And that, I think, is our task today. Thank you.